Good evening, colleagues, and welcome to another webinar. I'm really pleased this evening to be with Siobhan, who will be delivering our teaching EAL in the mainstream classroom. I'm really happy that we have so many people, so many teachers from around the world who are tuning in to our webinar. We had 103 teachers register, which has been our largest number of teachers that we've had who are going to be taking part in our webinar. And just to give you an idea, we've got teachers from the UK, Azerbaijan, it's a long list, Belgium, China, Cyprus, Egypt, Georgia, Germany, Greece, Hong Kong, Japan, Nigeria, absolutely everywhere. We've got teachers that are tuning in to the webinar this evening. So that's really, really pleasing to hear. So no pressure, Siobhan. Just to give you a bit of an idea about Siobhan. Siobhan has been an educator for 30 years. She's worked in both primary and secondary and has just got back from Pakistan literally 2 days ago. So really pleased to be to have Siobhan deliver the webinar for us on behalf of Veema Education. If you are interested in registering for other webinars, you can see from the first slide that we do have 2 more webinars before half term. So please do go onto our website and register for those if that's something that you want to tune into. And lastly, if you do have any questions for Siobhan, we won't be taking them today during the webinar, but if you can email them across to us at info@veema.co.uk, we will get back to you with some answers there. So I think that's enough from me this evening. I'm now going to pass you over to Siobhan. Have a good time, and we're all going to be listening in and getting some vital next steps and things that we can adopt in our classroom. Over to you, Siobhan.
Okay, thank you very much, Costa, and also thank you everybody for signing in this evening to listen to the webinar on teaching English or teaching your mainstream subject through using the English language. I'm very excited to be presenting this to such a wide audience. I'm used to presenting internationally, but this is the first time I've ever had people signing in from so many different countries at the same time. So before we get started, I'd like to just make sure that you've got some pen and paper with you, because you may have some ideas that you wish to jot down as we're going through this whistle-stop tour on teaching students whose language isn't English, but you are teaching subjects in English. First of all, could you jot down where you stand on a scale of 1 to 10, how confident you feel with teaching English, excuse me, with an additional language? I'll just give you a few seconds to think about that. And then when we come to the end of this presentation, I'd like you to go back to that number, and I would hope that if you've written down 3 at the moment, you would have risen by 2 points to 5 or 6. So in this very, very short webinar, I'd like to just talk to you about what I'm going to be covering, and that is we're going to develop an understanding of what our students face when learning English through learning through English, sorry. We're going to just explore a range of teaching strategies that can support the development of your students' English, as well as them being able to access the subject that you're teaching. I will then touch on the basics of the English language system. So let's begin. I'd like to just pose this question to you. Why is language important for subject teachers? I'd like you just to think about that for another couple of seconds, and perhaps jot down what your answers could be to that. I'd like you also to consider why is it not the English language teacher's responsibility for teaching English? Why is it your responsibility as well? What we could consider is that language is a vehicle for all types of learning. We need language in order to understand the subject that we're teaching. And most importantly, we don't want our learners to have barriers put up in front of them because they don't understand the subject that is being taught. We don't want language to be a barrier. So let's now think about what are the main challenges that our learners face when they're learning through English. Is it grammar? Do we use complicated grammatical structures and we switch between different tenses and we don't know, or our learners don't know what even tenses are? Is it the vocabulary that we use or the vocabulary that is in the textbooks? Is it the length of the sentences that we as teachers use or the lengths of sentences that are in the textbooks? And also, most importantly, I consider pronunciation can often be a barrier to learners' understanding. And it's actually pronunciation both ways. It's our pronunciation and also how our learners pronounce words themselves and how they see words differently on the page. So these questions are really just whetting your appetite at the moment. I'd like us now to consider how we use language and how we use language in the classroom. And in fact, we can think of, if I paint a scenario with one of my students recently, Joachim, who was talking to me very, very fluently about watching a TV series which is called Breaking Bad. And he was relating to me about the main actor who is a chemist, and he was describing in great detail the experiments that he was carrying out. And then I was really fascinated by what he was saying. And then I had asked him to actually carry out a piece of writing, and I was shocked by how he could not put his ideas down into words. And I later on found out that, if we look at it in a different way, rather, that we use language in two different ways in the classroom. We have something that is called BICS, which is the basic interpersonal communication skills, and that is the language that Joachim was using on a day-to-day basis, and he was fluent in that respect. He'd been in he had been in England for 5 years. He was 7, and so he was totally fluent in being able to converse with me and with his mates in the playground. But then when it came down to actually writing something down, he didn't have those language skills, or it's what we call cognitive academic language proficiency. So this is a different type of language that our learners need to use in the classroom. And what our role is that we have to bridge the gap between the BICS and the CALP. And this is basically what I'm going to be explaining to you over the next 30 minutes. There's a famous researcher called Cummins who's come up with the iceberg model, and we think of language, or the two languages that our learners have are like the two tips. I'll just show you the two tips coming out of the sea. They're the tips of the iceberg. We've got L1 and L2. With that, those two languages look completely distinct, but underneath everything here is fused together. And so we think that they've got the two different languages working alongside each other. But in fact, what happens is that inside the brain, language is actually stored all in one great big pot or mesh. Everything is fused together. So the features of the first language, it's not stored separately from the features of the second language. And in fact, this actually helps us with teaching bilingual students, because if they've learned something in one language, it means that they will be able to access that information and to be able to use it in their second language. So in a way, it's important that we try to keep the two languages going with our learners. Again, I'm just touching on lots of different theories here, trying to give you the background picture of why we need to keep the two languages going and why it's important that we recognise these challenges that our learners are facing when they're in the classroom with you. So really, we should be looking at how we can plan for learning to take place in the classroom. And if we consider two factors here, we've got to consider the cognitive challenge that our learners are going through in the classroom with all these ideas that you are presenting to your learner with your subject, as well as us ensuring that we can develop their language at the same time. So we want to make the lesson accessible for our learner. We don't want to dumb down the content of the lesson. We then want to encourage development of our learners' language skills, and we want to make the language understandable, comprehensible, and obviously improve their language skills. I'm also going to bring in Cummins again here, because he has devised this quadrant for learning, that if we think about this quadrant as we're actually planning for our learners, it can help us with ensuring that we are getting the content right for the learners. So again, this is like the bigger picture for you, and then when you actually come down to doing your planning, you won't always go A, B, C, D, but if you can actually just take a step back at the moment to see how we can help develop the thinking or the cognitive skills and the language skills of our learner. So if we think of the two lines, which are like two continua, and the fact is that there's one indicating the level of cognitive demand, that is the vertical axis, and then the other continua, which is signaling the presence of the contextual clues, and I'll go into this in a bit more, which is going along the horizontal axis. The quadrants that represent the different levels of challenge will go from A, you could say, as being the easiest, to D, which is going to be the hardest. I'll just give you another little diagram here. And so we want to be shifting our learners through the 4 different boxes. We want them to not always be unchallenged, but we may have to start off in the quadrant A box, whereby we're not challenging them with our subject content, but we're giving them lots and lots of language support by giving them visual clues and day-to-day language. And then we should be trying to move them through where, again, it's not so challenging for them. And then there's little context and day-to-day language. The best box I would suggest our learners to be in is when we have a lot of input supported by a lot of context, and also we are stretching the learners. The most difficult box, and it's quite often we think about exams, is when they're in the last box here, and when there's very little context and it is quite demanding for our learners. That is the last bit of theory I'm going to be giving you, okay? Let's give you an example here. And let's think of a geography lesson. So if I think about supporting my learner with labeling different parts of a volcano on a sheet. So all the language is there for my learner, and there are lots of visuals to help my learner. It's not very challenging though, in terms of cognitive demand. Perhaps planning a poster to illustrate river development could be slightly more challenging for my learner. More challenging though is asking my EAL learner to take part in a discussion on migration from rural areas. So that learner needs to have lots and lots of input from us on how he or she can take part in that discussion. I'm going to give you some answers in a moment. Then I've actually switched it to a maths problem. Here is is then solving, how do we solve problems in maths with no visual support at all? And that I will be giving you some strategies later on to help you. So the question really is now, where on earth do we start, really? We should be starting at the bottom of the ladder, okay? And really, I think it's with all good classroom practice is that we start with the positive. And we start always with lots of praise for our learners. Start with the positive. Then also try and find out what they know, and also give them credit for what they know as well. Then after that, we should be, if we are planning for our EAL learners, once we know what they know and what they don't know, and how we can actually scaffold their learning. Eventually, we want to actually be removing that ladder or that scaffold, but we know that we will have to do planning at the very beginning stages. So how can we support it? I'll go back. I like to think that you can build in 3 different steps. And we can think of it as having like content vocabulary. What content vocabulary do my learners need? What functional language do my learners need? And then what language skills do my learners need? The simplest approach really is here to think of what your learning objectives are for your lesson, And then to plan along a few extra stages of support. Sometimes I've seen or I have suggested with your actual lesson plan template is adding in 1 or 2 or 3 columns to represent these 3 questions that I've got here: content vocabulary, functional language, language skills. I'm going to go into more detail here what these 3 steps are. Perhaps though, I'll give you a couple of seconds to think of a learning objective from your particular subject. And if you can't think of a learning objective offhand like that, I've got one here for maths. And here, my learners have been asked to describe, compare, and measure 2D shapes. So I would be thinking here, going back, what is the content vocabulary that my learners need for this lesson? So for maths, 2D shapes, I would be thinking about the actual shapes themselves. I would perhaps be thinking of lines, measures, rulers, okay? I would think at this point as well, how am I going to scaffold the content vocabulary? I'm sure you may be using these techniques already in your subjects, but it's actually just reassuring for you to think, actually, this is helping your EAL learner by getting them to predict what the lesson is going to be about, or saying, for example, that we are going to be doing shapes this lesson, and just reminding them about where or what shapes there are. Using graphic organizers, I think are brilliant, such as concept maps or mind maps, fishbone diagrams. I'm a big fan of fishbone because I think you can just use cause and effect, pros and cons, advantages, disadvantages. Using glossaries are a very, very helpful tool. And also, if you get your learners to take ownership of these glossaries as well by them writing their own, they could have an additional vocabulary book to support the actual content of your classes, whether you wish to categorize that information by alphabetically or by topic. That's your decision. I would probably say to do it by topic. But as you come across a new term, is to actually for them to record it themselves, and by them recording it themselves, they're taking ownership, and also providing the definition. Now, the definition and also the word itself, you could, if it were easier, or if it's easier, you could use the first language as well. I mean, that is actually dependent on what the first language rule is in your actual school, because I know there are various schools of thought about that. The next thing is, is actually using wall displays in your classroom. So when you're doing certain topics, is to actually have all the keywords displayed on the wall. And I've just mentioned about using translation. I'm a big fan of actually saying, well, if you can actually find that word in your own language as quick as you can to explain what it means in English, please use it. So another strategy for dealing with the actual content vocabulary can be the use of visuals, flashcards, because pictures can again convey the meaning a lot quicker than using a definition. Another aspect is using modeling the language, and that's really just giving examples in the subject. I'm also a big fan of speaking frames and writing frames. I'll come on to that again when I'm talking about the language skills. So that is dealing here with the content vocabulary. And you actually, when you're planning your lessons, thinking, okay, what is the content vocabulary I'm using? And how am I going to actually either pre-teach or teach it when I'm actually teaching the main content of my lesson? How is that going to happen? The next step that I would be building in is what functional language do my learners need for that lesson? And so if we go back to the maths problem here, okay, here the learners are asked to describe, compare, and measure. So functional language is a bit like thinking, really, what are the thinking skills here that my learner needs, and what is the language that that learner needs in order to access the thinking skills behind it. So here, what is your learner being asked to do? So he or she is being asked here to describe, compare, and measure shapes. So what are the cognitive processes or the thinking skills that they're using? They're describing the shape. They are comparing the sizes of the shape, and then they're analysing the shapes. That is through the process of measuring. So we need to be able to support the functional language that goes with each of those with each of those cognitive processes. I'm only going to start off with comparing, which is the language that they need for describing the shapes. So they will need to think about phrases like larger than, the triangle is larger than the square, and the diamond is smaller than the rectangle, but both circles are the same. So it's going to be the language of comparison and contrast at this particular level here. Then my third step is actually thinking about how am I going to support the learning in terms of their language skills for this particular lesson on maths. What language skills are they going to be using? Perhaps just a moment to think of actually, what are language skills? Or what are the 4 language skills? We use listening skills, we use speaking skills, we use reading skills, and we use writing skills. In maths, you will be doing a lot of speaking and listening quite often with your problem solving. There is an element of reading, less so with your writing skills. But if you were to take another subject like geography, it's important that we can develop our writing skills with our learners, so that they can then produce, say at secondary level, essays to support their understanding. So let's think now then about those 4 skills and how can we support or scaffold listening skills. I would always think about, if I was showing a YouTube clip to demonstrate the effects of an earthquake, for example, I would give my learners some focus questions beforehand so that they know what they've got to listen for. I would also think about the sorry, so I've gone completely blank there. I would think about the length of time that they're listening to the clip. You can't listen for extended periods of time if your language skills are somewhat weaker. I would also give them perhaps the opportunity to have if it's going to be a video clip, for it to be repeated. If I'm explaining something in the classroom, okay, I would repeat the keywords a number of times in a number of different ways. I would rephrase my language or recast my language, because if you think about how a mother speaks to her child, she will say the same thing in quite a few different ways. I would also be using I would also demonstrate the language. I'd be using a lot of perhaps miming so that I could support their listening skills. So really, we want our learners to be active listeners. I would also ensure that I give my learners listening time. It's very important that we give them wait time as well. So if I ask a question to my class, I would expect to wait about 10 seconds before anybody could answer that, because they need to be able to process that language before they can come up with an answer. I'd also need to be very careful with how I actually phrase my questions. I sometimes suggest to teachers that they should write out a number of focus questions they want to ask their learners before they actually teach the lesson. So questions to check their understanding. How can you ask those questions? Now, next thing is, how do I scaffold their speaking skills? So I would perhaps give them speaking frames. If we're doing a debate on, say, in history about the start of the First World War, who was responsible for bringing in England into the First World War, and we wanted a two-sided debate, I would perhaps give them a speaking frame for if they were taking one side of the debate, and then giving them phrases for "I think that," or "in my view, Lord Grey did this." I'd also model the language for them verbally, and then hopefully they will pick that up. Then I would actually present it to them in writing. I think it's very important as well in a class to build in reflection time for at the end of the learning process is actually just to sit down and actually write down, or ask your learners to write down how they felt during that lesson. Next, how would I scaffold reading? So here, if you've got a longer text, again, it's a bit like the listening, is actually to give them focus questions beforehand. What are they reading the text for? You could be using some type of graphic organizer whereby they've got to sort the information out into advantages, disadvantages of migration. So it's that is one way of scaffolding the reading. Perhaps you could do some pre-teaching of vocabulary as well, but I would suggest that you don't pre-teach too much vocabulary, because it will take away from the actual meaning of the text, and it's best that words are taught in context. We suggest that you teach about 5 words in isolation, and then the rest of it we would encourage our learners to be able to deduce from context. Please remember that this is just a whistle-stop tour in actually helping our learners whose language is not English. Then lastly is like, how would I scaffold their writing skills? It's a bit like the speaking. I would give them writing frames to begin with. Then possibly I would do lots of getting them to do lots of drafting, lots of talking about the work before they actually have to commit to writing, doing lots of peer editing, and then starting off with short sentences, longer sentences, developing this into paragraphs and then into full text. So it's a question that you need to think, really, is like, how can I scaffold their writing skills? So now I'd like us to think about what is language. And I'm sure you know all of this actually, but I'll just actually recap with 6 different classes of words for language. We have the noun, we've got a verb, and we have got something called a determiner. So if we're aware of what these actual words are, we're able to help our learners build up their language skills. So a noun is a thing. It can be concrete, it's like a book, or it can be abstract, something that you can't see, like love or a feeling. A verb, it's a word describing an action, for example, run, but it's also a mental process that you go through, like think, and it's also a state that we are in, like, for example, to be. Then a determiner is a word that goes before a noun to say which noun it is. For example, the house, a farm, my car, or that shoe. So those are 3 of the word classes, and then another 3. Adjective is a word that gives more information about the noun. And then an adverb, a word that gives more information about a verb. So, for example, walk slowly, think carefully. Then a connective is a word that joins sentences or phrases together. For example, and, but, because. And if we can point these out to our learners as we're actually teaching our mainstream subjects, and also if you actually use common language throughout the school, it will help your learners immensely in terms of building up their vocabulary. So here, what I mean by this, and I think it does relate as well to the building up the content vocabulary, but I'm actually categorizing it now into different ways, is thinking about, as we mentioned already, doing lots of display work of the words, but also thinking about lexical sets, and that is thinking about, well, classifying them as nouns and verbs and adjectives. So perhaps if you actually are teaching, or if you're coming across the adjective interesting, getting them to think of as well, okay, that's an adjective, an interesting book, but what is the verb, or is there a verb? And it's to interest someone in something. When I'm building up these lexical sets, I would also be giving them examples of the language in context. So an interesting book, and I am interested in art, and then also the noun, my interest in art is. I'd also sometimes look at word roots. This helps your learners immensely if they can recognize the origins of the word, whether it's going to be a Greek origin, or if it's going to be Germanic or Latin origin. They will then be able to make associations, especially if they have come from those languages themselves. I'd be using word families, again, supporting my work with flashcards and getting them to do lots and lots at the very beginning, if they are new to the English language, to do lots of matching work with pictures, definitions, lots of games that you can play here, snap, bingo, and snap, bingo, Pelmanism. Now, this comes to very close to the end of the webinar, so I'd like to think that you have got lots and lots of questions to ask. Remember, this was a whistle-stop tour of teaching English through your mainstream subject. There's been a lot of work done on this, and we're very excited to have been able to present it today. If you do have questions, though, please do email us at Veema Education, and we will answer them as soon as we get your questions. It's been an absolute pleasure to have been with you today. I would just like to bring up some of the references that have been used if you want to go and do some further reading into the iceberg theory. That's with Jim Cummins. There's another very good book out, which is a toolkit for language awareness. And there's also a lovely little pocket book written that will actually help you. It's a very practical book. That brings me back now to, where do you stand? Now, you started off hopefully on the 3 to 5 range. I would hope that over the last 50 minutes that you have increased to up to 5, 6, 7. It's a lot of practice that you need to be able to incorporate those, I would say, those 3 steps. If you think of those 3 steps which you're planning for your learning, and that is content vocabulary, functional language, and also the language skills that you want your learners to use in the lesson, Just think of that when you're doing your lesson planning and you're going to be sailing. So I'd like to now say thank you very, very much for listening, and look forward to reaching out to you again soon. If not on air, it will be in your countries somewhere, sometime. And I will just leave you with these 2 slides about the fact that we connect you all throughout the world. And then if you would like to look at our lovely little library, which is at the top right-hand corner of our webpage. So thank you very much and goodbye. I'd like to say goodbye.